Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap. So first off, I think it's worth noting the sort of external thing about this play, the interesting and important thing about this play. This play has the longest production run in history. It has the longest continuous production run. I think the most productions, most performances of it in West End history, in world history, possibly within a single run. The Mousetrap ran continually from 1952 until 2020, when it was briefly closed for COVID, and then it resumed in 2021, and it's picked up since then. So, The Mousetrap is a murder mystery play set in a guest house in sort of rural England. It is a guest house run by the Ralstons, Molly and Giles. They are brand new to the guest house proprieting business. And so this is literally their first set of guests. They are concerned about things not going to plan. And then their eccentric guests start showing up. Christopher Wren is the first one who shows up, and he's a sort of avant-garde bohemian. I picture him as basically Lord Byron in the early 1950s. He's very interested in things like architecture, aesthetics, people's stories, stuff like this. Mrs. Boyle and Major Metcalf show up basically together. Mrs. Boyle is a somewhat older, matronly woman who has very conservative ideas about how a guest house should properly be run. Things like it should have a full staff. She complains a lot about things. Major Metcalf is a kind of stoic, older, ex-military guy, retired military guy. I kind of picture him with large mutton chops. It is what it is. Miss Casewell shows up. She's this kind of... It's not 100% clear, but I picture her as a very sort of bohemian, almost new woman type figure, even though this is the 1950s, and the era of the new woman was really like the 1880s through the Edwardian period. But I picture her as this sort of like showing up in a sharp suit with a nice trilby hat kind of figure. So those are the guests who are expected. Christopher Wren, Mrs. Boyle, Major Metcalf, and Miss Casewell. Then Mr. Paravicini shows up. He's a tough one for me to get a good read on. Let me see if I can find where we get the description of him. Because I think it's a bit problematic. I mean, this was 1952, so, that's how it goes. But he's presented as sort of... okay. Yeah, so it says he is foreign and dark and elderly with a rather flamboyant mustache. He's a slightly taller edition of Hercule Poirot, which may give a wrong impression to the audience. So the fact that it says he's foreign and dark is concerning. And he speaks with a sort of French code switching element, like he says some French words. based on what we learn about him toward the end, it does seem like he might be Swiss, but the fact that he's presented as dark is, I think, potentially problematic, racially problematic. I don't know. I might be reading too much into that. But he shows up. He's not an expected guest, but his car has driven into a snowbank, and he is hoping that there's a room available he can stay in. So those are the occupants of this house. When Molly Ralston gets a phone call from the police that they want to question her husband, or they want to pose some questions, not question necessarily in the sense that he's a suspect, but there had been a murder in London of an older woman, and the description of the killer is very vague. He is a nondescript kind of dude in an overcoat, a light scarf, and a hat, soft felt hat, which, as I think it's Miss Casewell points out, could be pretty much anybody. So they get a phone call that the police are going to come to ask some questions from Giles. They aren't really sure how the police are going to get there because they're completely snowed in. But then Detective Sergeant Trotter arrives on skis, so that's convenient. Basically, he informs them that there has been a murder in London, and they found a notebook with the address where that murder was committed, and then the address of this guest house. And there's a whole Three Blind Mice theme. They think that this is connected to an earlier case. The Livingston Farm. That doesn't seem quite right to me. Longridge Farm, sorry. Yeah, so there's the Longridge Farm case, which had happened like 20 years earlier, something like that, initially. Basically, they had these three orphans who were put into the custody of this couple on a farm. They abused and neglected these children. The youngest brother died, and then the two people on the farm, the Longridge Farm, were taken into custody, and they were sentenced to prison. The woman who was murdered in London was the woman who had been that farmer's wife, I guess, whatever it is. So she was murdered. They suspect by the oldest son from that three, the oldest brother from that three, who had basically who had deserted from his military service, had a history of insanity, and so the police assume that he is the killer, and that he's come to this guest house to try and kill one or both of the other Three Blind Mice figures, the other people that he blames for the death of his brother and the abuse that he and his surviving sister experienced. The people in the house all deny having any connection to the Longridge Farm incident. But we learn that Mrs. Boyle was actually connected very directly to the case, because Major Metcalf, who was living in Edinburgh at the time, says, "I think you were actually one of the magistrates on the bench at the time. In fact, you were responsible for sending those three children to Longridge Farm." Mrs. Boyle says, "Really, Major Metcalf, I can hardly be held responsible. We had reports from welfare workers. The farm people seemed very nice and were most anxious to have the children. It seemed most satisfactory. Eggs and fresh milk and a healthy outdoors life. Major Metcalf says, kicks, blows, starvation, and a thoroughly vicious couple. Mrs. Boyle says, but how was I to know? They were very civilly spoken. And then Molly says, interestingly enough, yes, I was right. It was you. And then that just sort of drops for the moment. So Mrs. Boyle, we find out, was the magistrate who had sent these children to the farm where they experienced this horrific treatment. And at the end of Act 1, she is murdered. Bum, bum, bum. So basically what happens is she's listening to the radio. A door behind her opens. The tune of Three Blind Mice is heard whistled. Mrs. Boyle turns with a start, and then, with relief, she says, oh, it's you. I can't find any program worth listening to. She moves to the radio and tunes it to the music program. A hand shows through the open doorway and clicks the light switch. The lights suddenly go out. Mrs. Boyle says, here, what are you doing? Why did you turn out the light? The radio is at full volume, and through it are heard gurgles and a scuffle. Mrs. Boyle's body falls. Molly enters by the archway upstage right and stands perplexed. Molly says, why is it all dark? What a noise. She switches on the lights and at the switch upstage right and crosses to the radio to turn it down. Then she sees Mrs. Boyle lying strangled in front of the sofa and screams as the curtain falls quickly. Ooh, ah. Yeah, so Mrs. Boyle is the first one to be murdered. Detective Sergeant Trotter, then his brief somewhat shifts because initially he is there to prevent someone from being murdered. Now he's here to solve this murder and prevent the third of the three blind mice being murdered. Everybody still refuses to acknowledge any connection to the Longridge Farm case. And finally, we find out toward the end that Molly was the one who had a connection to the case because she had been the teacher of these children, or at least the youngest child. And that youngest child had sent her a letter basically saying, hey, shit's real bad here. Can you help us out? But on that day, she had gotten pneumonia, so she didn't get that letter until after that youngest child had died. Nonetheless, the killer blames her for not having saved the brother, and so he attempts to kill Molly. Things do not work out that way. I won't give away the ending if you don't know. It's not that big a mystery because, again, it's run pretty much continually from 1952 to the present. But long story short, everybody basically, everybody is not who they say they were. So standard Agatha Christie type stuff. Now, the thing that I do find really interesting about this play is that there's a reasonable suspicion that everybody could be the killer. So we start with this really right from near the beginning because Molly is listening to the radio announcement. Two announcements, basically. One is about this murder in London. Two is that the snow is going to block everything off. So Giles actually does... There's this question of what do they know about their guests. And Giles actually says, some of these people may be criminals hiding from the police. But then Molly is listening to the radio again. The voice on the radio says, and according to Scotland Yard, the crime took place at 24 Culver Street, Paddington. The murdered woman was a Mrs. Maureen Lyon. In connection with the murder, the police are anxious to... There's bits where Molly does actions through here, and I'll talk through those in just a second. The police are anxious to interview a man seen in the vicinity wearing a dark overcoat, light scarf, and a soft felt hat. Now, what's important about this bit is that as the voice on the radio says, Dark overcoat, Molly picks up Giles's overcoat. Light scarf, picks up his scarf. And a soft felt hat, picks up his hat. A sharp-eyed viewer might notice that Giles has all of the characteristics that they are looking for in this person. Later, Giles finds a bus ticket to London in Molly's glove. She finds a London evening newspaper in his overcoat pocket. There's a bit where Molly, and Trotter are sort of arguing about this because Christopher Wren seems to be the obvious suspect because he's the most erratic of them. He's roughly the right age, and he actually did desert from his military service, so there's reasonable suspicion of him. But Molly also points out that it could be the father of these children who hadn't actually died. He had just disappeared or something like that. Major Metcalf could fit the description of the father, and if he has come back to seek revenge, he could be a suspect. Miss Casewell could be the sister. She could be back to seek revenge. Mr. Parvicini, they don't know anything about him. He could be disguising his appearance to try and look like someone else. So that's, I think, one of the most interesting elements of this play is how much Christie does to suggest to us that the murderer could be anyone. It's a really good technique for building suspense, because even if you're doing kind of what I did as I read the play and saying, all right, I'm on the lookout for clues. I know one of these people is a murderer. I'm gonna try and figure it out before Christie reveals it. There's so many clues pointing in different directions that it's hard to really know for sure which clues are reliable and which aren't.